I found the map on a late Sunday morning, buried under a pile of mismatched postcards and outdated guidebooks at the flea market. The paper was thick, almost waxy to the touch, with faint creases that hinted it had been folded and unfolded countless times. It smelled faintly of dust and rain, like something that had been forgotten in the back of a drawer for decades. The vendor, a man in a faded corduroy jacket, didn't seem to know much about it. "Old hiking map," he muttered, eyes drifting elsewhere. "Local forest, maybe. Yours for €2. I bought it without thinking. It wasn't the sort of thing I usually collected. But there was something about the soft bleed of the ink, the hand-drawn trails curling like veins through pale green shading, that made me want to see it up close. When I got home, I spread it across my kitchen table. It was a map of the forested hills just outside the town, a place I'd hiked through a few times. The trails were marked in dotted red lines, and there were small, almost delicate sketches of landmarks. A crumbling stone bridge, a tower, a pond ringed by reeds. The thing was, some of those landmarks didn't exist, at least not that I remembered. I'd walked most of these routes, and I'd never seen a tower or a pond in those spots. I told myself it must be an old map from before parts of the forest were cleared or built over. That night, after a long day, I walked past the kitchen and caught sight of the map again. I froze. The red dotted lines seemed different. Not by much, but enough that I couldn't shake it. A new fork had appeared along one of the main trails, a path that curved deep into an unshaded area of the map, where there had been nothing but blank space before. I stared for a long time, trying to remember if it had been there in the morning. My brain kept offering the same explanation. I hadn't looked closely enough before. But the part of me that notices small changes, the part that had once spotted a missing book from my own shelf after months, knew that wasn't true. I should have let it go, folded it up, put it in a drawer. But something about that new path tugged at me in a way I couldn't name, like it had been drawn for me and me alone. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the fridge, and I could feel my own breath in my throat, slow and shallow. I touched the paper. The ink of the new trail was still slightly darker than the rest, as if it hadn't had time to fade. By the next morning, I decided to see if it was real. The forest was still damp from last night's rain, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and something sweeter, like sap or overripe fruit. My boots pressed into the softened earth with a quiet squelch, each step accompanied by the faint, rhythmic dripping of water from the canopy. I'd brought the map folded in my jacket pocket, the corners of the paper slightly softened from handling it too much. I followed one of the marked trails I already knew, the kind that looped back toward the parking lot after a couple of miles. But as I reached the bend where the new fork had appeared on the map, I hesitated. There was no visible path here, just a faint thinning of the undergrowth and a darker space between the trees, like a suggestion more than a trail. It was strange. The light seemed to shift as I looked at it, as though the sun above had dimmed by some imperceptible degree. I took a step forward, brushing wet ferns out of my way. The air grew cooler, quieter. The further I went, the less I could hear the distant hum of traffic from the road. Even the birdsong thinned out, until there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of a branch swaying high above. The ground here was uneven, dotted with pale stones and patches of moss that seemed almost luminous in the gloom. The path began to take shape under my feet, subtle but deliberate, as if it had always been there but hidden until I stepped onto it. I unfolded the map. The fork was there, just as it had been last night, the red dotted line pulling deeper into that once blank expanse. But now, farther along, there was something else. A small square symbol I hadn't seen before. A building, perhaps. My pulse quickened. I ran my finger over it. The ink felt faintly raised, like it had been drawn not with pen, but with something that had weight and texture. I walked for what must have been an hour. Time seemed to stretch strangely here. The light never shifted much, neither brightening nor dimming, as though I were trapped in a single suspended moment of afternoon. The smell changed too. Less of damp earth now, more of something mineral, cold, like the scent of stone corridors in old buildings. My boots crunched over patches of gravel where there should have been soil, and I realized the trees were thinning. Then I saw it. Not a building exactly, but the ruins of one. A single wall, maybe 15 feet high, its surface mottled with lichen and trailing vines. There was no sign of a roof, no doorframe, no obvious function it might have once served. It stood alone in a small clearing, the ground around it bare except for a scatter of sharp, flat stones that reminded me of broken tiles. I approached slowly, feeling an odd resistance in the air, like moving through water. My fingertips brushed the wall. It was cold, far colder than it should have been in the mild afternoon. The stone was smooth in some places, pitted in others, as though parts of it had been worn by hands over and over for years. I took the map out again. The square symbol now had a faint, handwritten mark beside it, a looped curve that could have been a letter or maybe just a flourish. I was certain it hadn't been there when I left home. That was when I heard it. A sound so faint I might have dismissed it as my imagination if it hadn't repeated. A slow, deliberate scrape, like stone sliding against stone, coming from somewhere beyond the wall. The scrape came again, slow, steady, with a weight to it that suggested something deliberate, not the casual shifting of rocks. I moved to the side of the wall, my palms damp against the cold stone, and peered around the edge. Beyond it, the clearing narrowed into a kind of corridor between leaning slabs, the ground covered in the same pale gravel that crunched faintly under my boots. There was no movement that I could see, but the sound had stopped the moment I leaned forward, as if it were aware of me. I stood there listening. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. Even the faint rustle of leaves was gone, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. My own heartbeat felt too loud in my ears. I told myself to turn back. This was enough, more than enough. I could return to the main trail, go home, forget about the map. But my hand was already in my pocket, pulling it out. The square symbol for the ruins was bolder now, the ink thicker, darker, and from it, a new dotted line was branching out, arcing away from the wall into territory that, this morning, had still been empty. The line terminated in a small circle, a mark I didn't recognize. I stared at it for far too long, the paper trembling slightly in my grip, and realized I'd passed the point where I could pretend this was anything ordinary. I followed the new direction without fully deciding to. The corridor narrowed, the slabs of stone on either side leaning at strange angles, like the remnants of some ancient structure whose purpose had been lost. The air here had a faint metallic tang, like water drawn from deep underground. My breath fogged faintly, though it wasn't nearly cold enough for that. The path opened into another clearing, smaller than the first. At its center was something I first took for a cairn, a rough stack of stones waist-high. But as I approached, I saw they were arranged too precisely for chance. Flat slabs, each marked with faint, curling lines, like inscriptions worn down to near illegibility. I crouched, brushing the moss from one. The lines weren't just marks, they were maps. Tiny, intricate maps etched into the stone, each one different, each one impossible to read in full without turning the entire block. The air shifted, carrying a faint, rhythmic sound, like breathing, but deeper, slower, resonating in the stones under my fingers. My stomach tightened. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the edges of the clearing. The trees beyond seemed farther away than they should have been, their trunks receding into a haze that hadn't been there before. I looked down at the map again. The circle marking this place now had writing beside it. Not the looping curve I'd seen earlier, but something sharper, angular, almost like coordinates. My mind caught on the thought that the map wasn't showing me the forest. It was showing me where to be, where I was meant to go next. I don't remember deciding to stay longer, but when I finally looked up, the light was already changing, the air dimmer, and the path back toward the ruins no longer looked quite the same. I retraced my steps toward where the ruins should have been, but the corridor of leaning slabs was gone. In its place was a narrow track winding through denser trees, their trunks pressed close together like ribs, their branches knitting overhead into a ceiling that let through only fractured gray light. The air was heavier here, humid yet cold, and the ground was soft enough that my boots sank slightly with each step, releasing the sour scent of old, wet earth. The sound returned. Not the scrape from before, but a faint tapping, irregular yet intentional, as though someone were knocking against wood from far away. It seemed to shift locations as I walked, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes to my left, always just far enough to remain out of sight. I told myself I should turn around, find an opening back to the main trail, but the map in my hand had already changed again. The circle that marked the cairn was behind me now, and the dotted line stretched forward, looping and doubling back on itself in ways that made no sense geographically, leading toward a large, dark shape inked into the corner of the page. I don't remember deciding to follow it, but I couldn't stop. My feet moved as though the ground itself were tugging at them. The forest shifted subtly the deeper I went. The trees were taller now, but unnaturally straight, their bark pale and smooth, without knots or branches until they were impossibly high. I couldn't hear birds anymore. Even the wind seemed absent, the air unmoving, as if the world here had been sealed off from everything I knew. The track ended at a clearing, but not like the others. This one felt enclosed despite the open sky above. At its center stood a structure that could almost have been mistaken for a pavilion. 4 tall pillars of stone supporting nothing, their surfaces covered in the same worn etchings I'd seen on the cairn. The ground beneath them was laid with flat slabs, each one marked with fragments of what looked like maps, overlapping, contradicting, connecting places that couldn't possibly exist together. As I stepped onto the stone floor, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged, and a faint hum began to vibrate through the air, so low it felt more like a sensation in my chest than a sound in my ears. I glanced down at the map and saw that it no longer showed trails or landmarks. Instead, it showed the clearing I was standing in, drawn from above, with a small black dot at its center. The dot pulsed faintly, as though alive. The tapping stopped. In its place came something stranger, a murmur, almost a whisper, not in any language I recognized. It rose and fell like wind moving through a hollow space, but there was intent behind it, a cadence that felt like it was waiting for a response. My throat tightened. I didn't understand the words, yet a meaning pressed at the edges of my thoughts, half-formed and dangerous. You're not lost. You were brought. I stepped back, but my boot landed on a slab that shifted slightly under my weight. The whispering stopped mid-breath. Somewhere far below, something echoed, stone against stone, slow and deliberate. The air stilled completely. The map in my hand warmed, and when I looked again, a new line had appeared, one that began exactly where I stood, plunging deep into the page until it vanished into darkness. I don't know if I moved first, or if the ground beneath me gave way. One moment I was staring at the pulsing dot on the map. The next I was stepping forward without meaning to, my boot catching the edge of another loose slab. It tilted with a grinding sound, and the floor beneath it seemed to breathe. A slow expansion, then release, like the stones themselves had lungs. The map's new line, the one that vanished into darkness, seemed to ripple as I looked at it. And in that ripple, I realized something I'd been refusing to acknowledge. The map wasn't showing me the forest at all anymore. It was showing me, my location, my movement, and the dotted lines were choices, paths I could take, each already accounted for, already known by something that wasn't me. The whispering began again, clearer now, though I still couldn't make out words. It wasn't outside anymore. It was behind my ribs, in the marrow of my bones, a presence folding itself into my own thoughts, until I couldn't tell which ones were mine. My hand tightened around the paper until it crumpled slightly, but when I tried to let go, I couldn't. My fingers refused to release it. A sudden breeze moved through the clearing, though the air had been still all day. It smelled of damp stone and something electric, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. My eyes watered. When I blinked them clear, I saw the pillars differently, not as remnants of some broken structure, but as markers. 4 points of a boundary, a gate, and I was standing in the center. The black dot on the map brightened until it hurt to look at, and the dotted line extending from it seemed to sink deeper into the page, as though it were pulling my sight with it. I could feel it offering something, not in words, but in a promise that bypassed language entirely. It was the same pull I'd felt when I first saw the new fork appear on the map, but magnified, sharpened. It didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to understand. I thought of the cairn with its countless etched maps, each one a different route, a different arrangement of places. I thought of the slabs beneath my feet, each marked with overlapping paths, and I understood. Every person who had ever stood here had been given a map. Every map had changed. Every map had led them to this exact place, and then their path had gone where mine was about to go. My breath felt too loud in the silence. I could have stepped back. I could have run, left the map to rot in the dirt. But the thought of going back to my apartment, my job, the streets I'd walked 1,000 times, felt smaller than it ever had. Hollow, like I'd seen the edges of something too vast to unsee. I took one more step forward. The air shifted, colder now, and the whisper became a single, slow exhale, as if the forest had been holding it in for centuries. My vision dimmed, though the pillars stood unmoving around me, and just before the darkness closed entirely, I felt the map in my hand dissolve. Not like paper tearing, but like something living finally letting go. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing in a place I had never seen, under a sky the wrong color. My boots were on a trail I didn't recognize, and in my pocket was a new map. This one was blank, except for a single dotted line stretching forward into empty space. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to follow it.